Josh Pate joining us today on the Bud Light Hotline. Good morning, my friend.
James, how are we doing in Tuscaloosa today?
I tell you what, we are doing well, and I know we're a couple of months away still from getting a toe to leather when it comes to the 2019 college football season and the Crimson Tide coming out of the tunnel not too far away from you in Atlanta when it comes to kicking things off against Duke. So in the bigger picture, Josh, when it comes to the college football scene, when it comes to the Southeastern Conference, what has you excited for the upcoming season?
Oh, man. Listen, I think the competitive depth of the conference is, I don't want to do a comparative analysis of like the last decade and a half. Each year has its own uniqueness, but it's a very deep, and I think in some cases, an overlooked aspect of this conference is how deep it is this year. I know a lot of people will say that about the West, James, understandably so. I'm not sold on this idea that the East is just this one-horse race that Georgia's going to run away with and have things locked up by early November. If it were a roster comparison game, then that would be the case. And I'm not just talking about Dan Mullen at Florida. We were talking on our show last week. Man, I think Missouri's probably the biggest sleeper team in this conference and maybe one of the biggest sleeper teams in the country. Again, not because their roster compares, but because they've got about as favorable a schedule as you'll see. They catch Georgia coming off a bye while Georgia's coming off the Florida game. So they just have a lot of unique aspects of their schedule. They do a heck of a job developing talent there. Barry Odom always has a product whose total is greater than the sum of its individual parts. But then if you talk about Alabama and some of the big boys down here, you know, Alabama's in one of the rare positions that only Alabama could be in, where you're coming off a 14-win season with something to prove. So it's always, them, LSU, Auburn. I'm about 45 minutes away from Auburn down here. There's always, just below the cloud deck there, a ton of added drama that's in some cases unnecessary, but always seems to be present down here. So there is a lot of intrigue here. If you were writing a soap opera or if you're just interested in football, there's something for everyone this year.
So, Josh, you mentioned as far as the Auburn Tigers, especially another really important season as far as job security-wise for Gus Malzahn. How important is that very first game of the season against Oregon as far as setting the tone for the year?
I feel like we ask this question about Malzahn and Auburn more than any program, but you ask it for a good reason, because it always seems like he's in must-win mode, and it always seems like there's a game coming up, whether it's week 1 this year or, the first 2 or 3 weeks of the season. Last year it was the LSU game everyone has circled. And that was a must-win for him. Well, guess what? He lost it, and then he kept his job. So crazy things play out down here on the regular. But the Oregon game is huge. It's huge, James, because if you're already behind the 8 ball there, you got 2 factors to consider. One, you still have a gauntlet of a conference schedule coming up, and whoever you have started at quarterback in week 1, if you lose, I've got to assume that things didn't work out. Well, then all of a sudden, are you second-guessing the quarterback decision down there? And are you final at the most important position on the field? You also take into account Malzahn. I won't call it an offensive overhaul. I guess I'll call it an offensive rewind. He's going back to calling plays. They're going back to an offense predicated on tempo. It befuddled me how they ever got away from it. All this ever worked for him. But if they lose in week 1, although maybe it shouldn't be the case, but it will be the case that there's so much second guessing. And I'm not just talking about fans. I'm not talking about call-in shows, message boards. Certainly it'll be the case there. But I don't get the sense that there is 100% confidence in the head coach at Auburn within Auburn's own 4 walls there. And so you don't worry about so much what's going on outside your athletic complex. You worry about the attitude and the mentality within Auburn if things don't get off to a hot start. They need it. They need it about as badly as anyone down here needs it.
And you've got a quarterback battle going on with Joey Gatewood, with Bo Nix, especially with the schedule that they'll be facing again, as it seems that they face a tough schedule every season, Josh. So what have you heard about their quarterback situation, how they expect that quarterback battle to shape out?
I think that this was never a 4-man race. This was narrowed down to 2 very early in spring, and that charade, mainly to fill, ad copy space, was kept up through spring. And then Malzahn makes the announcement that we all assumed. I think that moving into the offseason, I believe Bo Nix has progressed a whole lot quicker than even they expected him to. And there is, I think, maybe a perception that doesn't quite match the reality, at least I've seen with my eyes. I made it a point to go over there. I wanted to be in the house for their spring game because I wanted to watch Nix. I wanted to see how the ball came out of his hand, but more importantly, I wanted to see how he moved. Nix is not some statue. This is not Brandon Cox reincarnated. He's got some mobility. He's got some athleticism about himself. And the reason I mention that is because everyone around here seems to think that the big edge Joey Gatewood has, aside from having been on campus one extra year, is that he has the physical tools that better fit a quote-unquote Gus Malzahn offense. I don't disagree with that. The issue that I have is people who say Bo Nix doesn't also have those characteristics. And I watched him right there standing next to Gus Malzahn in some cases on the field during A-Day. I mean, Bo Nix has some athleticism. Bo Nix can move. I'm not calling him a 1,200-yard rusher type potential guy, but he probably checks every box that Gatewood does in terms of what you think he can do for Gus Malzahn's offense. So whereas we entered the spring and, midway through spring, I was firmly in the Gatewood camp, and if you had to nail me down today, I would still pick Gatewood to start versus Oregon. I think it's a lot more competitive than probably they even thought it would be. This is going to go right to the wire, James. I wouldn't be surprised at all if this was unsettled still going into week one.
So if we look at this time next year for Gus Malzahn, because it was an unsettled offseason for Gus Malzahn as far as his job security. Is he back next year at this time at Auburn as their head coach?
My guess is yes, he is. That's not a popular guess, though. That's not a majority guess. And what I think is the most important thing to note here is there's a lot of similarities. For those of you who watch SEC football, you remember how the Kevin Sumlin era finally ended at Texas A&M. It seems like it wasn't like this, but it seems like he was there forever. And the last several years, they kept winning enough. They kept winning somewhere in that 7 to 9 win range, and they couldn't get a definitive result one way or the other. And being amongst Auburn fans down here, what these people want, for better or for worse, they just want something definitive. Even the big money types down here, the ones who have been really slow to write the checks necessary for some of these facility enhancements they want and they need. By the way, a lot of teams are lapping Auburn. Teams that have no business lapping Auburn are lapping them in the facilities arms race because a lot of folks don't want to write that check that they feel is an endorsement of Gus Malzahn, and that's a guy that maybe they don't necessarily support. So those types, all the way down to the guy who buys a $10 scalp ticket, like I always used to have to do, to sit in the nosebleed sections 10 minutes before kickoff, they want a definitive result. And if it's not 10-2 or better, I kid you not, most of these people they'd rather just hold their nose, and they'd rather go 6-6 than 8-4 or 9-3. Because to them, 8-4, 9-3 is not good enough to get where they want to be, but it's also not bad enough to get Malzahn fired. So regardless of what camp you're in down here, everyone just wants a definitive answer one way or the other.
We're talking with Josh Pate, a news anchor for WLTZ in Columbus, Georgia, but also host of The Late Kick here on The Gary Harris Show. And you mentioned as far as Missouri having a favorable schedule, but I talked about this on the show yesterday, and I look at LSU's schedule, at least how it shapes out, going into their matchup with Alabama in November. Other than trip to Texas, they've got a pretty favorable schedule ahead of them. So when it comes to the LSU Tigers, sleeper team, not only in the SEC, but nationally for you?
It's hard for me to call them a sleeper because I look at our in-house stuff. We partner with a group, and so we're able to have sort of our own proprietary power ranking type technology, which I'm very thankful for. I think right now, barring some kind of wild roster adjustment, James, we're going to open LSU the season number 3 in our rankings. I don't know where the AP or whatnot will have them. So I don't view them as a sleeper. I just view them as having the unfortunate task, as they do every year, of sharing a division with Alabama. I mean, if I were to put LSU in the Big 12, they'd be the favorite to win the Big 12, and therefore they'd be a favorite to make the playoffs. Ditto if I put them in the Big 10. Ditto if I put them in the Pac-12. And so I don't view them as a sleeper. I also think, to be honest with you, they're not a team that needs to beat Alabama to make the playoffs. So that's how good I think they are this year. You mentioned the schedule there. I think they'll be favored in every game until they play Alabama, and I think they'll be favored in every game other than when they play Alabama. So, I mean, I know we're looking way down the road, but it's June, so it's hypothetical season. You're telling me if LSU runs off an 11-1 regular season, which will include, as you said, a win at Texas, that would include a win against Florida, against Auburn, against Texas A&M. You're telling me that's not an attractive enough resume for that playoff committee who has already shown the propensity to put more than one team from the same conference in the playoffs? Yeah, I think they're a contender. I'm just not even calling them a sleeper. I just call them an outright contender.
So let's go a little closer to home for us. In fact, very close to home for us when it comes to Bama. What has you excited as far as just Alabama's 2019 campaign?
I love the changes that Nick Saban made on his coaching staff. One of the ways that I felt down the stretch last year, and watch Georgia this year, because we could end up saying this about Georgia this year, is not at the head coaching position, but maybe at some of the coordinator and position unit positions. I thought Alabama was thoroughly outcoached, not just in the Clemson game last year. Nick Saban knew that. He knew it well before we did. That's why he made the necessary adjustment. I think we may end up saying that about Georgia this time next year, looking back on 2019. But I love the changes he made there. I'm very excited to see what Najee Harris does. Finally tabbed, at least we assume, as the workhorse running back, but also with a very, very dependable 1A in Brian Robinson. I'm fascinated to see how Raekwon Davis responds to what most perceived to be a down season last year. It's sort of his de facto contract year. I think Xavier McKinney could very well be the best safety in the country. I think Trayvon Diggs, with a full healthy season, is a surefire first-round draft pick type. For that matter, I think Surtain is as well, although he's only a sophomore. That other inside linebacker position, opposite of Dylan Moses, I view that as Shane Lee's position, not to start the season. But I'm in love with Shane Lee, and I think it's a matter of when, not if, he ultimately gets heavily involved in that rotation. And lastly, not lastly, I could really go all day if you wanted me to, but time is a factor here. I think some of these freshman cats in that defensive line class, DJ Dale, I know already shined in the spring, but man, Alfano had some health issues in the spring that kind of kept him from probably being more of a breakout type as well. But not the headliners. Everyone expects it from Alfano. Another DJ Dale story is probably coming, James. DJ Dale's not a guy everyone expected to walk on campus and just say, oh, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to lock down a spot on the interior of this defensive line as a true freshman. That's what I'm going to do. Well, someone else, probably two or three guys, are going to do that as well. Where is it going to be? Is it going to be on the defensive line? It's going to be, like I said, Shane Lee at linebacker. I mean, where are those guys going to emerge? Is Evan Neal going to end up cracking that interior offensive line rotation that seemingly out of nowhere? I say seemingly because it's hard at his size to sneak up on anyone. But, man, again, for a team that went 14-1 last year, there's so much intrigue. There are so many questions, relatively speaking. A lot of people would die to have these questions about their team. But, man, I can't wait to that Week 1 game. I know they're favored by like 5 touchdowns, but I'm going to that game. I can't wait to be there.
So what do you think about Steve Sarkisian returning as offensive coordinator? Because I know it was just one game under some difficult circumstances when it came to his first game as an offensive coordinator in a national championship game, but still a lot of kind of residual criticism from that initial debut as Alabama's offensive coordinator. So with his first full season as far as being able to evaluate him as an offensive coordinator at Alabama, how do you see that move as far as Nick Saban bringing a former analyst and a former offensive coordinator back in the OC chair?
I love it, first off. Secondly, I think it's, like you said, just foolish for anyone to try and draw any conclusions from not only a guy who has a grand total of a one-game sample size. Let's please not forget, that wasn't the first game. That wasn't the semifinal. Maybe, if you get rid of Kiffin and Sark knows he's got a month ahead of time coming to where, hey, this is it. This is your game. Maybe it's a little bit different then. What did we have, like a week? 7, 8 days? So that's not even realistic. It's not a realistic sample size. What I love is the idea that if I were to go back to Tampa and I were to, even in that game, replace Jalen Hurts with Tua Tagovailoa, there are few truths, as Vern Lundquist once said, in an uncertain world, James, but I don't believe Tagovailoa's offense is going 3 and out like 8 consecutive times or whatever it was in the second half. And that was a one-possession final. So any of those possessions goes differently. We're talking about Sarkisian differently. And at the end of the day, even if I do doubt it, I look at Nick Saban's track record, and then I look at my track record, and I'm perfectly willing to defer to him. But in this case, I don't have to, because I love it, man. I love the move. I love, again, the upgrade. And this is no knock on Mike Locksley. This is just one example of an upgrade across the board in coaching acumen, experience, having been around the block in some cases at the pro and college level, and you're not sacrificing a ton in the recruiting department to get what you're getting with Nick Saban this year. So, I mean, as is usual the case with him, he's in kind of a best of both worlds scenario.
Josh Pate from WLTZ in Columbus, Georgia, as well as host of The Late Kick with us. And we talked about Auburn, also over in your neck of the woods. Just what's kind of the opinion as far as Georgia for the 2019 season?
James, I did a segment the other day on our show. It was about Auburn fans. And I said, it's probably going to surprise a lot of people that don't live in the South and are not Auburn fans. But today, when Georgia plays Alabama, as they have the last 2 years in a row, I think folks would be shocked to know how many Auburn fans will admit to you privately, off the record, that they pull for Alabama, which makes no sense because it's their biggest rival. That's how sick to death a lot of people are in the state of Georgia of listening to Georgia fans. Now, if you're a Georgia fan, you couldn't care less, and you love it. But there is a lot of unbridled optimism here. Last year when the SEC championship game ended the way it did, there was certainly the most criticism I've heard to date of Kirby Smart after that botched, fake punt, whatever in the world that was on a 4th down against Alabama. So, yeah, he dealt with it for about 2 weeks. But then the recruiting class comes in, all's well, and they expect nothing less than a playoff appearance this year, which begs the question to me, that's the glass half full. That's the best case. What happens if this defensive line, which is, make no mistake, a big question mark for them in terms of depth, quality, competitive depth, what happens if that unit never materializes and it's, slightly above average by SEC standards at best, and they can't get off the field on 3rd down against the meat of their conference schedule, and they end up either going to Atlanta as a prohibitive underdog and not winning, or what happens if they don't make it to Atlanta? What happens if reality hits Georgia, as has been the case with Alabama and every other great team out there? I don't get the sense over here in Georgia, James, that Georgia folks are ready for that possibility. They certainly aren't entertaining the idea of that possibility. What I experience over here is what you and I would call best case scenario for them is viewed as the most likely scenario. And so there is a potential shock to the senses in the not too distant future coming to some folks over here who I don't think are ready for it.
Before we let you go, Josh, just kind of give us a little preview of what to expect and how we can find you on The Late Kick.
Yeah, by far the best way, and I appreciate you having me on today, the best way is just go to YouTube, our YouTube channel. It took me a while to get on that platform, but I regret I didn't do it sooner. It's exploded. It's given us access to so many more of you than just locally here in the Columbus, Georgia market. But you go on YouTube, just search Late Kick, like Late Show, but Late Kick instead. You'll find our page. Subscribe to that thing. It's important, though, to click that bell for notifications because, as you know, James, we do a ton of live shows. We're doing one a week now, but we do 3 live shows a week during the regular season. I mean, we span mainly the SEC, but we extend a little bit further when it's relevant to our audience. And, we pride ourselves on giving you content that's of a different flavor than you expect from the other 90% out there. So, I mean, we got a great and very much a growing audience, big in Tuscaloosa and Alabama and beyond. So the Late Kick on YouTube, that's how to find us.
Well, Josh, we're going to have to get you on again, my friend, at some point. Thanks for joining us.
I appreciate it. Hey, James, if you could bottle your voice up and send it to me, that would take our show to the next level. I very much appreciate that.
Oh, there you go, my friend. Thank you, Josh.
All right, thanks, man.
You got it. Josh Pate from WLTZ in